with regard to information, the Swedes knew a lot all the time. Throughout the entire Nazi period, Swedes had reporters, diplomats, military people, cultural exchanges, so there's always a lot of information coming back and forth. Throughout the 30s, when something happened in Germany against the Jews, it's reported the next day in Swedish newspapers. So the information flow is very, very strong. The Swedes were never for a German victory, but they had to make their accommodation with regard to the power of Nazi Germany and little Sweden in the north. There were always Swedes who protested against anti-Jewish measures, but there were always Swedes, and they made policy, who said it's okay. For instance, after Kristallnacht, other embassies, other nations withdrew their ambassadors in protest. Sweden did not. Once the murders began, the real murders in 41, in many ways, Swedish officials and the Swedish newspaper reading population knew of things immediately. For instance, when the Einsatzgruppen got to Kaunas, to Kovno in Lithuania, there was a report in a Swedish newspaper, not about the killings, but about forcing them into the ghetto, treating them very badly. There's a report in the newspaper. In September 1941, there's an article in the main Swedish newspaper, the biggest Swedish newspaper, 50,000 Jews are gone from Croatia. Where did they go? From 39, when Sweden declared its neutrality, it was of course not neutral before that, from 39 to 41 to 42, Sweden kept Jews out. It took active measures to keep refugee Jews from getting in, except for a few different individuals. Sweden didn't care about German Jews, Czech Jews, Polish Jews, Lithuanian Jews. It did not, and that's a fact. Throughout the summer of 42, even more information was coming in to the Foreign Office, to the Foreign Ministry. And there was one individual there who very much, his attitude towards helping Jews was affected. There's a couple of interesting incidences I could tell you about. They take a long time. But an SS lieutenant, Kurt Gerstein, told a Swedish diplomat what was going on in Belzec, specifically. That, combined with other information throughout the summer of 42, began to change one individual. He was the head of the legal division of the Foreign Office. The key individual in the Swedish government was a man named Gösta Engsell. He was the head of the legal division of the Foreign Office. And he's very interesting because he made the leap of imagination that no other Gentile diplomat made until later, of taking information into action. And then when the final solution comes to Norway in October, November 42, that's when the Swedish government switches its position. So here we have an instance during the Holocaust, of information actually changing attitudes. And that's very important. Quite often, even information did not. For instance, in October 1942, there's a big headline in an important newspaper, "The War of Extermination Against the Jews," written by an important guy with a lot of details. When the Einsatzgruppen were active in 41, Winston Churchill's getting reports from British intelligence because the Germans were transmitting by radio and it was being intercepted. Then they went to only paper transfer. The U.S. and the British government knew something was wrong very early. Then, of course, you have the declaration in the 18th of December, 1942, when Foreign Minister Anthony Eden in the House of Commons declares that the war of extermination is going on and criminals will be punished. But the U.S. and the British throughout 43 did nothing. And this is what we speak of: bystander nations, nations which did nothing but knew of the ongoing extermination. It's from the fall of 42 into 1943 that the Swedes break away from the Americans and the British with regard to their reaction to the Holocaust. This is when, in 43, when the Swedish Foreign Office begins to become active in helping individuals and some families. Well, this is one of the myths about Wallenberg, that Swedish rescue activity began when he arrived in July 44. This is a myth. Immediately upon the occupation of Budapest by the Germans on 19 March 1944, Jews began to go to the Swedish embassy looking for help because they had heard throughout Europe that Sweden was helping Jews. And from March through July, a lot of rescue efforts, mostly with paper, giving out paper, which is exactly what Wallenberg did for the most part as well. So what Wallenberg is a link in a chain of rescue activities that existed before he got to Budapest. And what the Swedes basically were able to do is transfer, to give Swedish citizenship to some Budapest Jews, declare them Swedish so they could not be deported, because the Germans didn't deport Swedish Jews. Yes, absolutely. This, what I call bureaucratic resistance, the resistance by a bureaucracy against the implementation of Nazi racial policy, happened through paper, through telephone calls, through visits. One Swedish diplomat to a German diplomat. And there's many interesting instances about that. And in the Swedish case, it begins in Norway, as I've indicated. It expands throughout 43. Denmark is a very large episode. And then the whole Budapest episode represents the height of bureaucratic resistance, as I've defined it. We talk about desktop murderers during the Holocaust, men who just gave orders for people to be killed. The Swedes represent desktop rescuers, and that's a very important category of historical actor during the Holocaust and other genocides. Well, for decades after the war, they thought of it as separate history, as Jewish history, maybe European history, German history, but definitely not Swedish history. Swedish historians were not interested in the Holocaust. They simply weren't, and there's lots of evidence for that. Things have changed, as elsewhere in Europe, from the mid-90s on, when the whole Nazi gold issue blew up in Europe, and that began a very strong shift in Swedish attitudes, both academic and political and social, towards understanding the Holocaust, that it was a part of Swedish history as well, yes. Now, with regard to the mid-90s, it was very much the then Prime Minister, Göran Persson, who very much became engaged and active and made an enormous difference in changing Swedish attitudes and influencing, well, the Swedes started the International Task Force for Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research, and that's very much his good works. The whole issue shows how important political leadership is on very controversial issues. And Göran Persson, the Prime Minister then, showed strong leadership in putting the Holocaust in the open in Sweden, and it influenced elsewhere, yes.